They thought humiliating her would be entertainment for the night, but they had no idea they were about to witness the quiet collapse of everything they believed about power, class, and talent. The Langford Art Gala shimmered beneath cascading chandeliers, their golden light reflecting off polished marble floors and crystal glasses filled with $1,000 champagne, the kind of place where every laugh was measured and every glance carried judgment, where wealth wasn't just displayed but silently enforced. And at the center of it all stood Victoria Langford, draped in a custom silk gown that whispered privilege with every step she took. Her posture sharp, her smile practiced, her eyes scanning the room not for connection but for hierarchy, for status, for anyone who didn't belong. And that was exactly when Emily Carter walked in. She didn't make an entrance, not the kind anyone noticed at first. Just a simple woman in a modest navy dress that cost less than the valet tips being handed out at the door, her shoes practical, her hair neatly tied back, her presence quiet but steady. And yet something about her didn't align with the room, not because she looked out of place, but because she didn't seem to care that she was, and that alone made people uncomfortable. Conversation slowed, not completely, but just enough for whispers to begin, subtle glances exchanged behind half-raised glasses, the kind of silent communication elite circles perfected over years of practice, and within seconds, Emily had been categorized, labeled, dismissed. Victoria noticed her next. Of course she did. She always did. Her gaze locking onto Emily with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime deciding who was worthy of acknowledgement and who was not. And in that instant, she made her decision, a faint smirk forming as she leaned toward the group beside her, murmuring something that sparked quiet laughter, the kind that didn't echo but still managed to cut through the room. Emily, meanwhile, moved calmly, taking in the artwork lining the walls, her eyes lingering not with confusion but with recognition, as if she understood something deeper than the price tags displayed. Beneath each piece, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of a program booklet, her expression composed, almost thoughtful, and for a brief moment, it seemed like she didn't notice the shifting energy around her at all. But she did. She always did. Years of being underestimated had taught her to read rooms faster than anyone in them, to recognize the subtle shift in tone, the quiet tightening of smiles, the way people reposition themselves to create invisible barriers. And yet she didn't react, didn't shrink, didn't adjust her presence to fit their expectations. She simply continued walking, steady, unbothered, and that, more than anything else, was what caught Victoria's attention. Because in a room built on validation, Emily Carter was the only one who didn't seem to need it. And that made her dangerous, even if no one there understood why. The music softened as a live quartet transitioned into a slower piece. Conversations resumed their polished rhythm, but beneath the surface, something had shifted, something subtle yet undeniable, like the air before a storm no one had predicted. And as Victoria straightened her posture, setting her glass down with deliberate elegance, her eyes never leaving Emily, she made a silent decision that would change the entire night. Because in her world, people like Emily weren't just ignored, they were corrected, put in their place, turned into lessons for everyone else watching. And she believed, with absolute certainty, that this would be no different, that this simple woman had walked into a room she didn't understand, into a game she couldn't possibly win. And as the faintest hint of amusement returned to her lips, Victoria Langford stepped forward, completely unaware that she had just taken the first step toward her own quiet undoing. Victoria did not rush, she never did, because in her world power was not loud. It was deliberate, measured in pauses and glances. And as she crossed the marble floor, the subtle shift in the room followed her like a current, conversations softening, attention bending toward her presence. Because when Victoria Langford moved with purpose, people noticed, and more importantly, they watched to see who would become the subject of it. Emily had just paused near a large abstract painting, its bold strokes layered with complexity that most guests admired without truly understanding. Her gaze steady, almost analytical, when Victoria's voice arrived before her presence did, smooth, polished, and edged with something just sharp enough to draw attention. "Enjoying the collection?" she asked, her tone light, but carrying just far enough for nearby guests to tune in. And within seconds, a small circle began to form, drawn not by curiosity about the art, but by the promise of social theater. Emily turned calmly, meeting Victoria's gaze without hesitation, her expression composed, neither defensive nor impressed, and that alone created the first flicker of discomfort beneath Victoria's perfect exterior. "It is remarkable," Emily replied softly, her voice even, thoughtful, as if she were speaking to the painting rather than the woman in front of her, and a faint ripple of amusement passed through the surrounding guests. Subtle smiles exchanged as they anticipated what would come next. Victoria tilted her head slightly, her smile widening just enough to signal the beginning of something intentional. "Remarkable," she repeated, as though testing the word for weight. "That is an interesting choice. Most people here would describe it with a bit more insight." A few quiet laughs followed, carefully controlled, socially approved, and Emily simply nodded, as if acknowledging a comment that did not require correction. "Insight often depends on what someone is looking for," she said, her tone unchanged, and for a brief second, the room hesitated, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it, calm, unshaken, uninvited to the hierarchy that everyone else seemed to follow without question. Victoria's smile held, but her eyes sharpened, recognizing something she did not immediately understand, and rather than step back, she leaned further in. "And what exactly are you looking for?" she asked, this time louder, inviting the room fully into the exchange, and now the circle tightened, guests subtly repositioning themselves to watch more closely, glasses paused midair, conversations abandoned without apology. Emily glanced back at the painting for a moment, as if considering the question seriously, before returning her gaze to Victoria. "Truth," she said simply. The word landed quietly, but it carried, not because it was dramatic, but because it did not belong in a room built on appearances, and for the first time, Victoria's control slipped just slightly, not enough for most to notice, but enough for those paying close attention to feel it. She let out a soft laugh, turning briefly to the group beside her, as if to share the moment. "Truth," she echoed again, her tone now edged with something more deliberate. "That is quite a bold pursuit for someone attending an event like this." More laughter followed, this time a little louder, a little more confident, as the room settled back into its comfort zone, reassured that the balance of power remained intact. Victoria took a small step closer, lowering her voice just enough to make the next words feel personal, even though everyone could still hear them. "Tell me," she said, her smile returning to its polished perfection, "do you often find yourself in rooms like this, or is tonight a special occasion?" The question hung in the air, carefully crafted, designed not just to expose, but to define, and around them, the room leaned in, waiting, because in moments like this, someone always folded, someone always revealed exactly where they stood. But Emily did not answer immediately. She simply held Victoria's gaze, steady, unhurried, as if time itself had slowed around her, and in that silence, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, because for the first time that night, the outcome of this exchange was no longer predictable. Emily finally spoke, her voice calm and measured, as if the question carried no weight at all. "I go where I am invited," she said, and the simplicity of the answer created a ripple of quiet confusion, because it neither confirmed nor denied what Victoria was trying to establish. It simply refused to play along, and that subtle defiance did not go unnoticed. Victoria's smile tightened, just slightly, the kind of shift only someone watching closely would detect, but it was enough to signal that she was no longer amused. She was now invested. "Invited," Victoria repeated, her tone lighter but her eyes far more focused. "That is interesting, because this event is quite selective," and the implication settled into the air, unspoken but clear, drawing a few more guests closer, their attention sharpening, sensing that the moment was escalating beyond casual conversation. Emily nodded once, acknowledging the statement without challenging it, and then she added, "Yes, it is, nothing more, no elaboration, no attempt to justify herself." And that was when the balance shifted again, because in a room where status was constantly explained, displayed, and defended, Emily offered nothing, and that absence of explanation created a tension that could not be easily dismissed. Victoria exhaled a quiet laugh, turning slightly to include the growing circle around them, her voice lifting just enough to invite participation. "Well then," she said, "perhaps you can help us understand something." And now there was a subtle change in tone, a move from curiosity to performance, from conversation to demonstration, the kind of shift that transformed a private exchange into a public moment. She gestured lightly toward the painting Emily had been studying, its bold colors and layered textures now serving as an unspoken stage. "Since you are searching for truth," Victoria continued, her words smooth but edged with intent, "why do not you tell us what we are all missing?" A soft murmur passed through the group, a few raised eyebrows, a couple of knowing smiles, because everyone understood what this was, a test disguised as an invitation, a setup carefully constructed to expose the limits of someone who did not belong. Emily glanced at the painting again, her gaze lingering for just a second longer this time, as if she were deciding something, not about the art, but about the moment itself, and then she looked back at Victoria, her expression unchanged, steady, composed, almost thoughtful. "You want me to explain it?" she asked, not to clarify, but to confirm the intention behind the request, and Victoria's smile returned. Brighter now, confident, assured. "Please," she said, stepping back half a pace, creating space, not just physically, but socially, as if granting permission, as if offering an opportunity that could only end one way. The room leaned in, conversations fully abandoned now, the soft music fading into the background as attention narrowed to a single point. Glasses held midair, breaths quieted, because moments like this were rare, unscripted yet entirely predictable. At least that was what everyone believed. Emily stepped forward, not dramatically, not hesitantly, just one small, deliberate movement that brought her closer to the painting, her posture relaxed, her hands resting loosely at her sides, and for a brief moment, nothing happened, no immediate response, no rushed explanation, just silence. And in that silence, something began to change, because instead of filling it, Emily allowed it to exist, stretching it just long enough for discomfort to settle in, for expectations to rise, for the room to realize that whatever came next was not going to follow the pattern they had already decided. Behind her, Victoria watched closely, her confidence still intact, but now sharpened into anticipation, certain that this would be the moment everything became clear, that Emily would reveal exactly what everyone had already assumed. And as the seconds passed, the air itself seemed to hold still, waiting, because no one in that room realized yet that they were no longer watching a simple woman being tested. They were watching the beginning of something none of them were prepared to understand. Emily did not rush to speak, and that alone began to unravel the confidence that had filled the room just moments before. Because in a space where people competed to sound intelligent, silence was unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, and as the seconds stretched, the subtle shifting of weight, the quiet clearing of throats, the faint clink of glass against glass became louder than any words could have been. Then, without turning to face the audience, Emily lifted her hand slightly toward the painting, not touching it, not claiming it, just acknowledging its presence with a quiet precision. That felt intentional. "Most people here are looking at the colors," she began, her voice calm, steady, carrying just enough to reach every corner of the room without ever needing to rise. And immediately, a few heads tilted, expressions tightening as they tried to follow her direction, unsure whether to dismiss her or lean in. "The contrast, the boldness, the price tag," she continued, her tone unchanged. "But that is not what the artist was trying to show." A soft murmur rippled through the crowd, subtle but present, because now she had crossed an invisible line. She was no longer just answering, she was correcting, and that was not something people like her were supposed to do in rooms like this. Victoria's smile remained, but it no longer reached her eyes, her posture still perfect, her chin slightly raised, as if holding her place in the hierarchy through sheer will. "Oh," Victoria said lightly, though there was a faint edge beneath the word. "And what exactly are we missing?" Emily turned then, slowly, not toward Victoria, but toward the group as a whole, her gaze moving across faces that had already decided who she was. And for the first time, there was something different in her eyes, not anger, not defiance, but clarity, the kind that came from knowing something others did not. "You are missing the restraint," she said simply. The room stilled again, but this time it was not confusion, It was uncertainty. Emily continued, her words measured, deliberate, each one placed with care. The artist limited the palette on purpose. Every color here is competing for attention, but none of them dominate, because the message is not about expression, it is about control. About knowing exactly how much to reveal and how much to hold back. A few guests glanced back at the painting, their expressions shifting, not entirely convinced, but no longer dismissive, and that subtle change was enough to create a crack in the atmosphere that had felt so solid before. Emily took a small step to the side, giving them a clearer view, not commanding attention, but guiding it. If you look at the lower left corner, she added, you will see the only place where the brushwork breaks pattern. It is intentional. That is where the truth is. Now the silence was different, heavier, more focused, as several people leaned in slightly, their earlier confidence replaced with something quieter, something closer to curiosity, and in that moment, the dynamic shifted again, not dramatically, but undeniably. Victoria's fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her glass, a detail small enough to go unnoticed by most, but significant enough to reveal that control was slipping, not outwardly, but internally, and that was something she was not used to. She let out a soft laugh, though it carried less certainty than before. That is quite an interpretation, she said, her voice still polished, but no longer effortless, very imaginative. A few guests echoed her sentiment with polite smiles, but the energy had changed, the laughter no longer unified, the agreement no longer automatic, and Emily simply nodded, accepting the response without challenge. It is not imagination, she replied quietly, her gaze steady. It is intention. And that was when the room went completely silent, not because she raised her voice, not because she demanded attention, but because for the first time that evening, no one was entirely sure who was supposed to be in control of the moment anymore. For a moment, no one spoke, and in that silence something unfamiliar began to settle over the room. Not embarrassment, not yet, but the quiet discomfort of people realizing they might have misjudged what they were looking at, and more importantly, who they were looking at. A man near the back adjusted his glasses and leaned slightly closer to the painting, his earlier disinterest replaced with a cautious curiosity, while another guest tilted her head, studying the lower left corner Emily had mentioned, her expression slowly shifting as if something was beginning to make sense that had not before. Victoria noticed it immediately. Of course she did. She always noticed when control began to slip, even in the smallest ways, and that subtle shift in attention, that quiet redirection of focus away from her and toward Emily, was something she could not allow to continue. She stepped forward again, reclaiming the physical center of the circle, her posture flawless, her voice returning with practiced ease, though now it carried a sharper edge beneath its polish. Art is subjective, she said smoothly, lifting her glass slightly as if punctuating the statement with authority. Anyone can assign meaning if they try hard enough. A few guests nodded quickly, grateful for the familiar ground, for the return of something they understood, and a soft murmur of agreement followed, not strong, but present, like a safety net being quietly pulled back into place. Emily listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, and when the room settled again, she spoke, not to challenge, but to clarify. Subjective does not mean random, she said gently, her tone steady, her words precise, and once again, the room paused, because there was no confrontation in her voice, no need to dominate, only a quiet certainty that was becoming harder to dismiss. She took a small step closer to the painting, her gaze steady as she continued. There are patterns here that are not accidental. The repetition, the restraint, the break in symmetry, those are decisions, not guesses. Her voice remained calm, but there was a weight behind it now, something grounded, something practiced, and it carried through the room in a way that felt different from before, not louder, but deeper. Victoria's smile held, but it was no longer effortless, her fingers tightening again slightly around her glass, her eyes narrowing just enough to show that this was no longer entertainment for her. This was something she needed to regain control over. "And how would you know that?" she asked, her tone light, but the question sharp, direct, designed to force a boundary, to demand proof. And this time, there was no mistaking the intent behind it. The room leaned in again, but now the energy had changed, no longer expectant laughter, but focused attention, because this was the moment that would define everything that had just unfolded. Emily did not answer immediately. She let the question sit in the air, just long enough for its weight to be felt, just long enough for the room to settle into. Complete stillness once more, and then she turned her head slightly, her gaze moving not to Victoria, but to a small plaque mounted discreetly beside the painting, something most people had glanced at briefly and then forgotten. "Because the artist signed it twice," she said quietly. A ripple of confusion passed through the group, several people instinctively looking toward the plaque, others scanning the canvas again, searching for something they had missed, and Emily continued, her voice calm, unwavering. "Once where you expect it, and once where you do not. The second signature is hidden in the brushwork, integrated into the pattern, but it is there, and it only appears when the structure is intentional." The room shifted again, but this time it was not subtle, it was visible, heads turning, bodies leaning forward, eyes narrowing as they tried to see what she was describing, and the quiet confidence that had defined the evening began to fracture in a way no one had anticipated. Victoria did not move, but for the first time, she did not speak either, and in that silence, the balance tipped just a little further, because the question she had asked, meant to expose Emily, had instead exposed something else entirely, something no one in that room was prepared to ignore. At first, no one moved, as if the entire room had collectively forgotten how to react, eyes scanning the painting with a kind of urgency that had not existed before, searching for something they were certain they had missed, something that now felt obvious simply because Emily had said it. A man stepped closer, leaning in just enough to examine the brushwork more carefully, his earlier confidence replaced with quiet concentration, while another guest adjusted the angle of her view, squinting slightly, as if the truth might reveal itself if she looked hard enough. Then someone near the edge of the group spoke, not loudly, but enough to break the stillness. "Wait, I think I see it," he said, his voice uncertain but rising with realization, and that was all it took. The shift spread quickly, like a ripple moving across still water, as more guests leaned in, pointing subtly, murmuring to one another. Their attention no longer guided by status, but by discovery. The room, once defined by quiet judgment, had become something else entirely, a space of reconsideration, and at the center of it stood Emily, not commanding the moment, not claiming it, simply allowing it to unfold. Victoria remained still, her posture unchanged, but the control she had once held so effortlessly was no longer absolute. And for the first time that evening, her expression flickered, just for a second, just enough to reveal that she had not anticipated this outcome. She took a slow breath, lifting her chin slightly as if resetting the moment, her voice returning with practiced composure, though now it carried something else beneath it, something closer to caution. "That is an interesting observation," she said, her words carefully chosen, her tone measured, but there was no laughter this time, no easy agreement from the crowd, because the room had already begun to move beyond her influence. Emily turned slightly, her gaze meeting Victoria's, calm, steady, and without any trace of triumph, as if this had never been a competition to begin with. "It is not just an observation," Emily said quietly, and the simplicity of her tone carried more weight than any grand statement could have. "It is a signature method." The words settled into the air with quiet authority, and once again, the room fell silent. But now the silence felt different, heavier, more focused, as if everyone was waiting for something they could not yet name. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, her composure holding, but her certainty beginning to fracture, because this was no longer about interpretation. This was about knowledge, and knowledge was something she could not dismiss as easily. "Signature method?" she repeated, her voice still smooth, but now edged with something sharper, something closer to challenge. And whose method would that be? The question hung in the air, deliberate, direct, and for the first time, it was not meant to entertain the room. It was meant to regain control of it. Emily did not answer immediately. She let the question exist, just long enough for the room to settle into complete stillness. Again, just long enough for every eye to return to her, and then she spoke, her voice soft, but unmistakably clear. "The artist who painted this does not sign their work in the traditional sense," she said, her gaze shifting briefly back to the canvas. They embed their identity into the structure itself, into the decisions no one notices unless they know where to look. A quiet murmur passed through the crowd, but it was no longer dismissive. It was searching, trying to connect the pieces, trying to understand what they were hearing. Emily took a small step back, giving the painting space again, as if returning it to the room. That is why most people miss it, she added, her tone unchanged, because they are not looking for the right things. The words landed gently, but they carried a quiet implication that no one could ignore, and for the first time that evening, the hierarchy that had defined the room felt uncertain, unstable, as if it had been built on something far less solid than anyone had believed. Victoria did not respond right away, and in that pause, something shifted completely, because the question she had asked, meant to expose Emily, was now waiting to expose something else entirely, and the answer, whatever it was, would not just change the conversation, it would change how everyone in that room saw her. The silence did not break immediately. It stretched, deepened, settled over the room like something heavier than uncertainty, because now every person there understood that whatever Emily was about to say would not just answer a question, it would redefine the entire moment. Victoria held her ground, her posture still composed, her expression carefully controlled, but the faint tension in her jaw betrayed the shift beneath the surface, because this was no longer a performance she could direct. This was something she had already lost control of, even if she had not yet admitted it. "Go on," Victoria said finally, her voice smooth but tighter than before, the words less an invitation and more a necessity, because now she needed the answer just as much as everyone else in the room did. Emily looked at her for a brief moment, not with defiance, not with superiority, but with a quiet understanding, as if she had seen this moment coming long before it arrived. And then she turned her gaze back to the painting, her voice calm, steady, unmistakably certain. "This piece was created by someone who does not exhibit under their real name," she said, and immediately, a subtle ripple of recognition passed through parts of the crowd. A few exchanged glances, a few raised brows, because now the conversation had moved beyond interpretation and into something more specific, something real. Emily continued, her tone unchanged. "They are known for embedding a second identity within their work, a pattern that only appears when the structure is deliberate enough to carry it." A man near the front frowned slightly, then looked back at the painting, his expression sharpening as if something was beginning to connect, while a woman beside him whispered a name under her breath, not loud enough for everyone to hear, but enough to signal that this was no longer unfamiliar territory. Victoria's composure tightened further, her fingers still wrapped around her glass, though she no longer lifted it, because now she was listening, truly listening, and that was not something she was used to doing in moments like this. "That artist," Emily said softly, her eyes steady on the canvas, "has only revealed their identity once, and only to a very small audience." The room leaned in again, but this time it was not anticipation of humiliation, it was anticipation of revelation, and the difference between the two was undeniable. Emily paused, just briefly, not to create drama, but because the moment required precision, and then she spoke again, her voice carrying with quiet clarity. "I was there." The words landed without force, without emphasis, but they echoed through the room with a weight no one could ignore, and for a second, no one reacted, because the implication had not fully settled yet. Then it did. A sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the crowd, a glass lowered slowly, eyes widening, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that something fundamental had just shifted. Victoria blinked once, a small, almost imperceptible break-in. Her composure, as she processed what had just been said, her mind moving quickly, trying to reconcile the simple woman in front of her with the statement that did not belong to someone like her. "You were there?" Victoria repeated, her voice still controlled, but no longer effortless, the question no longer rhetorical, but searching. Emily nodded once, her expression unchanged, her presence still quiet, but now anchored in something far more solid than before. "Yes," she said simply. No explanation, no elaboration, no attempt to convince, just a statement that did not need to be defended. The room fell completely silent again, but this time it was not uncertainty. It was recognition beginning to form, slow, deliberate, undeniable. And as eyes moved from Emily back to the painting, and then back to Emily again, the realization started to take shape. Not fully, not yet, but enough to change everything that had come before. Because the question was no longer whether Emily understood the art, it was how deeply she was connected to it. And for the first time that night, Victoria Langford had no immediate answer for what she was seeing. The words did not echo loudly, but they settled into the room with a quiet finality that no one could ignore. And for the first time that evening, the silence carried weight instead of expectation, because now everyone was no longer watching a spectacle. They were witnessing a realization unfold in real time. A man near the front stepped back slightly, his eyes moving from Emily to the painting and back again, as if recalibrating everything he thought he understood just minutes earlier, while another guest let out a soft breath, her hand lowering the glass she had been holding midair, forgotten. That private showing? 2 years ago. Someone whispered from the edge of the group, their voice low but unmistakably clear in the stillness, and another voice followed, hesitant but certain. Only collectors and critics were invited. The murmurs began to spread, no longer dismissive, no longer amused, but searching, piecing together fragments of memory, of reputation, of stories they had heard but never fully understood. Victoria did not move immediately, but her stillness was no longer control, it was calculation, her mind working quickly, trying to place Emily within a narrative that made sense, and failing. That is not possible, Victoria said finally, her voice measured, but lacking the effortless confidence it once carried, because this was no longer about proving someone wrong. This was about protecting the image she had built so carefully. Emily did not respond right away. She simply met Victoria's gaze, calm, steady, without urgency, as if the truth did not need to be defended, only recognized. Then she turned slightly, her attention shifting once more to the painting, and in that small movement, the room followed her again, almost instinctively, as if the center of gravity had changed without anyone realizing when it happened. The second signature is not just a mark, Emily said quietly, her voice guiding rather than commanding. It is a conversation between the artist and the observer, a test of whether you are looking to understand or just to admire. A few guests nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition, their earlier certainty replaced with something quieter, something more reflective, and the energy in the room softened, no longer sharp with judgment, but open with reconsideration. Victoria's grip on her glass loosened slightly, though she did not raise it, her posture still composed, but her presence no longer dominating the space the way it had before. And you recognized it, she said, her voice lower now, more controlled, but undeniably different, because now she was no longer addressing someone beneath her, she was speaking to someone she did not yet understand. Emily inclined her head slightly, a small acknowledgement rather than a declaration. I recognized it because I helped develop it, she said, and the words did not rise, did not emphasize themselves, but they landed with a quiet force that shifted everything completely. The room froze again, but this time it was not uncertainty or curiosity, it was realization, clear and undeniable, moving through the crowd like a wave that could not be stopped. A man near the center exhaled slowly, his expression changing as the pieces aligned, while another guest looked at Emily with a new kind of focus, not judgment, not curiosity, but recognition of something far greater than they had assumed. Victoria blinked again, slower this time, her composure still intact, but no longer absolute, because now the narrative had changed in a way she could not control, and for the first time that evening, she was not the one defining the moment. Emily did not step forward, did not claim attention. She simply stood where she was, calm, grounded, allowing the truth to settle on its own. And as the room absorbed what she had said, the shift became complete, because the woman they had dismissed, questioned, and quietly mocked was no longer an outsider to the room. She was the one who understood it better than anyone in it. And in that realization, the hierarchy that had once felt so certain dissolved without a single word needing to be spoken. No one applauded. No one spoke, because the moment did not call for noise. It demanded understanding, and that understanding settled slowly across the room like a truth that could not be rushed, only accepted. The chandeliers still cast their golden glow, the music still played softly in the background, but the atmosphere had changed in a way that could not be reversed, because now every glance toward Emily carried something entirely different, not dismissal, not curiosity, but respect forming in real time. A man who had earlier turned away from her now stepped forward slightly, his posture more careful, as if approaching something he did not want to misjudge again, while a woman near the painting lowered her voice to a whisper, speaking not to challenge, but to confirm what she now understood. "You helped develop the signature method," she said, and this time it was not a question, it was recognition. Emily did not react with pride, did not step into the attention that had shifted toward her. She simply nodded once, her expression still calm, still grounded, as if nothing about this moment required performance. Victoria stood very still, her glass untouched in her hand, her posture still elegant, but no longer commanding, because the authority she had, carried so effortlessly earlier in the evening, no longer belonged solely to her. For the first time, she did not immediately speak, and in that pause, the room waited, not because they expected her to lead, but because they were watching to see if she could recover what had already been lost. When she finally did speak, her voice was softer, more measured, stripped of the effortless superiority it once carried. "You should have said something," she said, and the words, though simple, revealed more than she intended, because they carried the assumption that Emily needed permission to belong, that her value should have been announced to be recognized. Emily looked at her then, her gaze steady, not confrontational, not dismissive, just clear, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to narrow to that single exchange. "I did," Emily replied quietly, and the weight of the answer was not in the words themselves, but in everything that had already happened, in every moment that had been overlooked, every assumption that had been made too quickly. Victoria's expression shifted, just slightly, as the meaning settled in, and for the first time that evening, she did not have a response ready, because there was nothing left to correct, nothing left to control. Around them, the room had already moved on, not away from Emily, but toward her, guests now approaching with a different kind of attention, questions forming not from skepticism, but from genuine interest, conversations beginning that did not revolve around status, but around understanding. The painting remained exactly where it had been all along, unchanged, yet now seen differently by everyone who looked at it, not because it had transformed, but because they had. Emily did not stay at the center for long. She never intended to, as she stepped slightly aside, allowing the space to settle into its new balance, her presence still quiet, still steady, but no longer invisible. Victoria remained where she was for a moment longer, her reflection faintly visible in the polished marble beneath her, her composure intact, but altered, as if something within her understanding had shifted, not dramatically, but enough to matter. And in the end, there was no dramatic exit, no final declaration, no need for one, because the lesson had already taken root in the only way that truly lasts, not through words, but through realization, the kind that lingers long after the room empties and the lights fade, the kind that quietly reminds everyone who was there that respect is not something you assign based on appearance. It is something you recognize when you finally learn how